Welcome, everyone, to today's presentation. We'll be just letting people have a few moments to log in, but we will start right up at 2 minutes past the hour. So thank you for joining us. If anyone does have any technical issues, you can send me a question or through the chat would be the best place. Let's leave the questions section for questions of today's presenter. We'll start up in 1 minute. We've got just about 100 people on the call as of right now. And it's 12:02. We will go ahead and get started, 12:02 Eastern. And for those joining us from the West Coast, thank you for joining us so early. Hello, welcome to today's presentation on the Tpch 2021 Model Legislation Update. I'm Melissa Netto, the project manager for the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, which is also known as IC2. It's a project of NUMOA and one of the sponsors of today's event. I'm also the program manager for the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse, a program of NERC, our other presentation sponsor today. Today, we're going to hear from John Gilkeson of the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse about their recent update to their model legislation, specifically adding PFAS and orthophthalates as regulated chemicals. Before we dive into the presentation, I'll go over a few logistics and also share a little information about IC2. If you have any audio issues, please note the phone call-in details under the audio button in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you have any questions for the presenter, please enter them into the questions section of the control panel and we will address them after the presentation. It's possible that we may address some questions during it, but most of them, if not all, will be addressed after the presentation, just so we can make sure we can get through all of the material. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted online on the IC2, Tpch, and NERC websites in the near future. We will also share the slides with all of you after the event. Kevin Masterson from Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality and the chair of IC2's training work group will be assisting us today during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Now let's bring on our presenter, John Gilkeson. John, are you audio is working well for you?
Yep, I'm here.
Great, great. Yep, loud and clear.
Are you going through your introductory slides?
I'm going to tell a little bit about you, and then I will do that. So, okay. John has worked for the state of Minnesota for over 30 years with a focus on prevention and management of problem materials and toxic substances in products and wastes. John has represented the state in several state, national, and international efforts to address mercury, lead, and other toxic substances. That includes representing Minnesota in IMERC and chairing the labeling committee for several years. John has represented Minnesota in the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse since about 2003 and has been the chair for the last 6 years. In large part, that's because 4 of the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse's lifers, as John calls it, who had all served as chair, they recruited him and then they retired between 2014 and 2020. So really happy to bring John on. I've worked with John for the last 4.5 years at the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse, and he's just has a wealth of information. And John, I'm now going to just start the slides. I'm going to just give a little introduction right before I bring you on, John, just to give people some background, a little bit about the IC2. It's an association of state, local, and tribal governments promoting a clean environment, healthy communities, and a vital economy through the development and use of safer chemicals and products. And the goals of the IC2, I won't read through them all here, but just to give you an idea, avoiding duplication, enhancing efficiency and effectiveness of agency initiatives, building governmental capacity to identify and promote safer chemicals and products, and making sure that agencies, businesses, and the public have ready access to high quality and authoritative chemicals, data, information, and assessment methods. These are some of the other projects in the IC2. Many of them are our databases. We also have webinars throughout the year, and we have an alternatives assessment library. You can find a lot of this information on our website, theic2.org. And these are the work groups of the IC2. We have groups in procurement, Pfas, alternatives assessment, equity, database, training, and governance. And if you have any questions about the IC2 or how to become a member, here's all of my contact information, and here is the website address below. And now we're moving into what John likes to have as story time. So John, we are ready for you, and I will be running the slides for you, so just let me know when you want me to advance them. So thank you for joining us, John.
All right. This story time slide is courtesy of Sharon Yurjo, who used to be with New Hampshire DES. So I'll thank her for that slide. I wouldn't have done it myself, but I really like to have it. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. First, I want to say that we worked on the updated model toxics and packaging law for 3.5 years. So in the 60 minutes we have today, or 30 minutes for the presentation, I can't cover everything we did in that time or go into a lot of detail about Pfas or orthophthalate science. But I think you'll have a good idea of how and why we arrived at what we have put together and why these changes are the right changes to make. The Toxics and Packaging Law has a very strong foundation, manufacturer and supply chain responsibility for pollution prevention. We did not have to create that, but 30 years after its creation, we did need to determine how to apply it to conditions today and to have the flexibility and a process in place for the law to apply to what we think will be important considerations in the future. We're going to start with some important history and background of the Toxics and Packaging Laws in the Clearinghouse. The historical overview in the first several slides was developed by 2 longtime members in 2016. Chip Foley was a staff person at the Council of Northeast Governors in the 1980s when this started, and he's remained involved ever since, representing the Steel Recycling Institute, and now in retirement. Sharon Yurjo of New Hampshire DES was involved as the New Hampshire representative from the early 90s until she retired in 2016. So this is story time from Chip and Sharon. Next slide, please. Once upon a time, in 1983, the state of New York passed a law that started the process of closing landfills on Long Island and in other places. Before there was enough capacity in waste-to-energy facilities, the price of disposal started to get prohibitive, and in 1987, the people responsible for trash arranged to send it via a barge named the Mobro to North Carolina. Only the proper arrangements had not been made, and it was rejected, and the barge continued south down the coast until it reached Key West. It was rejected in North Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, New Jersey, the Bahamas, Mexico, and Belize. And when it finally returned to New York, the city prohibited it from docking or unloading, and the private company declared bankruptcy, leaving the waste abandoned. It took a while, but local and state government finally arranged to have it incinerated in Brooklyn. Next slide, please, I guess. This was a real problem for governors of the Northeast, and the governors were meeting to figure out how to address this and knew they had to publicly commit to waste management and recycling. One of the governors, possibly Madeline Kunin, Democrat Democratic governor of Vermont, said, wait a minute, we have a waste management hierarchy, and source reduction is the top of the hierarchy. And that includes toxicity reduction. And at this point, the governors actually kicked the staff out of the room and had this discussion among themselves. And they wanted to concentrate on source reduction and needed to reach out to industry. The Republican governor of New Jersey, Thomas Keene, said, well, we also need to include environmental groups in this. And several became involved: Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, National Audubon, Environmental Defense Fund, and Natural Resources Council of Maine. All of the major materials were represented: steel, aluminum, paper, glass, and plastic. Major manufacturers that became involved included P&G, James River, Paper, Sears, Pepsi, ExxonMobil, Scott Paper, the list goes on. At the time of the garbage barge and the Source Reduction Council, the Council of Northeast Governors was the 9 northeastern states, the 7 shown here, plus New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The CONAG, as it was known, created the Source Reduction Council to address the issues. The council was chaired by Maine and co-chaired by Scott Paper and Natural Resources Defense Council. All of the member states participated, plus all of the groups that I've already listed, plus many others also participated. Next slide, please. So what they came to focus on was packaging. And if you think about it, it's a single-use, short-lived product, makes up a significant amount of the waste stream, and may be either disposed of, ending up on a barge, or recycled into new products. And so if you think about toxics, that's really the worst thing that could happen with packaging. There's no need for toxics in short-lived, single-use products. There are always non-toxic or less toxic alternatives that provide the necessary properties. Next slide, please. So after long discussions among the members of the Source Reduction Council, there was agreement that these are the bad actors and could be addressed by the council without engaging in extensive risk assessment. The science was in place, and the public also understood that these substances were a problem. Next slide, please. The model legislation was developed in late 1989, approved January 3rd, 1990. The key requirements: no intentional introduction of these 4 metals, and incidental presence limited to 100 parts per million total. The requirements apply to each individual packaging component and the package in its entirety. Limited exemptions for recycled content and reusable containers, for example, were included for a short period of time, and then they were sunsetted and only available upon application to and approval by an agency commissioner. New Hampshire was trying to enact it first, but the Republican governor of Maine, Jock McKernan, attached it to a non-germane bill, and it was the first enacted among all the states. New Hampshire Governor Judd Gregg, also Republican, was not happy about this, but New Hampshire enacted it 2 days later. Next slide, please. How do the laws work? They create a producer and supply chain responsibility. And if you think about toxics and packaging in a product, pollution prevention by the producer is the purest and simplest form of producer responsibility. The model law and the state laws have a unique form of compliance. The certificate of compliance is generated by the manufacturer of the packaging component and must be provided by the manufacturer and up through the supply chain on request of the public or a unit of government, or to anyone downstream in the supply chain. This is also sustainable because the manufacturer of that component or product no longer relies on the life cycle or the economy of the toxic substance. That is, you can get out of the upstream extraction, processing, worker exposure, and unrecoverable use of a toxic substance, and it removes the limits or constraints or negative impacts on the downstream management of the used packaging, whether that's recycling, incineration, landfilling, animal bedding in some cases with paper products, source-separated organics, even littering, though we don't want to promote that. We aren't putting the toxics into the environment through littering. Next slide, please. Some success stories. In the early days, lead foil wine bottle wrappers, cadmium pigments in yellow plastic containers that yellow plastic container is still on the market without cadmium. Lead solder. Regarding this last bullet about lead and cadmium and flexible plastic film, the U.S. industry phased this out quite quickly after the laws were passed, but overseas producers took much longer to do that. We were finding them in imported packaging between 2006 and 2015. In our last screening project in 2015, we were still finding cadmium, but lead was no longer present. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse. It is a membership organization of the states with the laws and technical representatives from industry associations for various types of packaging. Unfortunately, we recently lost two of our industry association members. The Steel Recycling Institute no longer has a program in this area, and the American Chemistry Council decided they would not renew their membership this year. As of right this time, our only association member is the Glass Packaging Institute. We've had other members in the past. What does TPCH do, the Clearinghouse? It maintains and updates the model, as we have just done. It coordinates implementation of state laws to promote consistency among the states. It serves as a single point of contact for companies, which saves companies a lot of time and effort. And we have also been carrying out packaging screening projects since 2006. Next slide, please. 19 states have toxics and packaging legislation. 9 are members of the Clearinghouse, and 10 are not. A couple of the states that are not members were very active in Koenig and worked very hard to develop and enact the law, including Maine, Vermont, and Pennsylvania. Maryland was also very active, though it was not a member of Koenig. So I showed this map to a group just before the 2018 elections, and it occurred to me that it's really an interesting map of political representation among the states with the laws. The states with the laws have 276 electoral votes, 238 House members, with representing 54.3% of the U.S. population before this week's Census Bureau announcements. On the other hand, these states only have 38 senators, so you can draw your own conclusions about that. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to get into the model legislation update process. We started this discussion in 2016. One of our newer members who was active in their state safer chemicals and products testing program asked the question, isn't it more than just the 4 metals that we are concerned about? Shouldn't we be thinking about other substances in packaging or a process for identifying and adding new chemicals? And it was really a timely question because in December 2016, Walmart released its sustainable packaging playbook for suppliers. So we knew we weren't the only ones thinking about this. This Walmart playbook talked about enhanced material health, remove priority chemicals, and it cited the European Union REACH list of criteria for priority chemicals. The Walmart playbook addressed design for recycling, avoid substances and manufacturing methods that hinder recycling, adhesives, films, pigments. And we would add, avoid substances and manufacturing methods that pose a problem in all end-of-life management systems, recycling, composting, incineration, landfilling, and you have to consider littering and open burning because that's the reality in some parts of the country. 2 states have language for identifying and adding chemicals to their law, but it was still not enough to go on, nor was there previous work by the Clearinghouse or by Koenig that really served as a guidepost for us. Next slide, please. So in late 2016 and early 2017, we did a lot of background research on these issues, looked at state, federal, international, NGO, and industry efforts to identify toxic chemicals in packaging or toxic chemicals in general. We looked at criteria and processes for identifying and prioritizing chemicals for attention. We looked at risk assessment processes. We looked at the lists of chemicals that various groups had assembled and what the criteria were for doing that. We had a full 2-hour meeting of all the members in February 2017 to discuss that several months of work, and we decided we needed a subcommittee to do in-depth research and bring it back to the full membership, and we did that and discussed it every month throughout 2017. When I was reviewing files for this presentation, I found this first item, which I'd forgotten about. Probably didn't seem very important at the time. In January 2017, there was a Washington state bill to phase out PFAS in food packaging, effective in the 1 year later, without any exemptions or allowances for any uses. But that did not pass. Throughout this time, we also consulted with our own state agencies and our own experts in various issues, including the Pfas, our Pfas work groups where we have them. Next slide, please. So moving into 2018, note the first bullet here, a headline from early 2018, CEH report issued its report on fluorine levels in PFAS-free compostable foodware. We probably didn't realize how important this was at the time, but it is important. It really hit the news later in 2018 when it was picked up in the trade press. Throughout 2018, we continued to work on risk assessment, alternatives analysis, look at lists of chemicals and criteria, look at what different people were doing. And we produced draft documents for discussion within Tpch. And then the first new substance was added to a toxics and packaging law in 2018. The Washington Legislature enacted a law banning the use of PFAS chemicals in fiber food packaging 2 years after an agency alternatives analysis finding of safer alternatives available for applications. And that's specific applications if you look at the details of the law. As PFAS became more important, we looked more closely at what the scientists and policymakers were saying. A couple of things stood out to us. We need criteria for essential use. There are strong indications we need to regulate PFAS chemicals as a class. We don't have adequate analytical methods, and we have risk assessments for just a few chemicals, and they aren't necessarily transferable to other chemicals. Next slide, please. We continued working on this into 2019, and Maine enacted 2 very interesting laws in 2019. First, they amended their toxics and packaging law to add a definition of food packaging that's not limited to fiber-based. And that toxics and packaging law also allowed Maine DEP to ban PFAS from food packaging by rule 2 years after finding that a safer alternative is available for specific applications. And available means, quote, available in sufficient quantity at comparable cost and performs as well as or better than PFAS in a specific application. And this amendment to toxics and packaging also includes a hard phase out of orthophthalate chemicals in food packaging as of January 1st, 2022, with no alternatives analysis, no exemptions, and no rulemaking. Second, the Maine Legislature enacted a new law, 32 MRSA Chapter 26B, that's modeled on other statutes for identifying, listing, and acting on chemicals of concern. There's a lot to this, and I can't go into detail here, but essentially the department can list up to 10 food contact chemicals of high concern, meeting certain criteria that are laid out in the law. And then the department can identify priority food contact chemicals on that list that meet additional public health criteria and are known or suspected to be in packaging. And once that's done, it sets in motion a process of manufacturer use reporting, reporting of the need for the use, a study and disclosure of health and environmental issues, identification of alternatives to the chemical, and then ultimately there's a pathway to ban the use of the chemical. So these laws in Washington and Maine provided us with a template for addressing PFAS and orthophthalates, and also process and criteria for identifying and adding other chemicals to the Toxics and Packaging Model Statute. Next slide, please. So taking our 3 years of work and the templates of these laws in Washington and Maine, we had the pieces we needed to update the Toxics and Packaging Model legislation. We looked at the emerging and changing science of PFAS chemicals, consulted with our agency experts, and it became evident to us that we need to address the PFAS family, and a chemical-by-chemical approach would simply not be feasible. We continued the law's pollution prevention approach for all packaging in this manner, and also because we have to clean up the material that's recovered and put in a new packaging and minimize health and environmental impacts of packaging that are not recycled. The model includes a 2-year phase-out period for PFAS family chemicals and orthophthalate family chemicals. We made a deliberate choice to not include an exemption process for specific PFAS uses for 2 reasons. One, we never had an exemption request for any of the 4 metals that are covered in the original law. And 2, we wanted to see if an exemption process for the chemical families or specific chemicals was requested in public comments on our draft. The model includes criteria and a process for identifying new chemicals based in large part on the Maine legislation, and then it allows the state agency to phase out that chemical through legislation or rulemaking. So there's opportunity for public participation in the process of identifying these chemicals, and then again in the phase-out process through law or rule. We eliminated all the exemptions and allowance language from the current model because they've either never been requested or they've expired over 10 years ago. One thing we kept, if you're asserting that the use of the metals is required by a state or federal government, you have to disclose the use and the reason, and then we know what the driver is, and we can work on safer alternatives to get rid of that use. So I want to say a little bit more about addressing PFAS as a class. These are some of the considerations and questions that we asked ourselves and talked about. It's really a complex area. We don't have the tools to address chemical by chemical exemption requests or deal with the analytical procedures that would be necessary to determine if somebody is in compliance or not in compliance. So I think it's really important to note that no commenters requested any exemptions or alternatives analysis process or similar procedure in the law for the PFAS chems or the orthophthalates. Another thing I need to mention here is that we reviewed the draft model legislation with our association partners for 2 months before we went out in the public comment period, and we incorporated their concerns in the model that went out for public comment. Some additional guiding principles on addressing PFAS as a class. We looked at the Madrid statement, which covers many of the issues that I've mentioned briefly already. Criteria for essential use, labeling and disclosure potentially if there are uses, avoiding products in procurement, ensure that there's safe management and disposal systems for PFAS containing packaging products. For chemical manufacturers, develop non-fluorinated alternatives. Next slide, please. Product manufacturers, stop using PFAS where they're not essential and where safer alternatives exist. Invest in the development of non-fluorinated alternatives. Consumers, avoid PFAS products. Be aware of the performance criteria that PFAS products bring. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. We missed the.
No, you were talking about them. Do you want the Madrid, after Madrid?
Yeah, National Toxicology Program. So we also reviewed the National Toxicology Program report on PFAS and pulled out a couple highlights here from Senate testimony. NTP conducted a systematic literature review concluding that PFOA and Pfas are presumed to be a hazard to healthy immune system function in humans. And they recommend approaching PFAS as a class for assessing exposure and biological impact as the most prudent approach to protect public health. Next slide, please. So additional policy considerations are that if you put toxics in commerce, you have to have an obligation for end-of-life recovery. This can be done with some durable goods, but very difficult with packaging. Packaging is a commodity item, so people like to put in performance features or bling, and that often includes forever chemicals and toxics, electronics, pigments, film plastics with certain qualities. And one question we asked ourselves, is it appropriate to use forever chemicals in an application that may last 10 to 20 minutes in fast food, a couple months in other food packaging, maybe 6 months in some other product package? The upstream and downstream impacts dwarf any short-term benefit. So how are we doing on time? We're not too bad. I'll skim through the next couple quickly.
Yeah, we're good, John. We've only received one question so far. So if people do have questions, please submit them in the question section so you can continue going as you'd like, John.
Okay, I've just got a few more slides here. I'm just drawing some parallels between PFAS and other toxics. Some of you may have seen this headline a week ago. Researchers discover forever chemicals around the summit of Mount Everest. Now, there's an initial claim that this is from the use on Mount Everest. I'm guessing it's probably going to turn out to be more than that. But for me, this really brought home why we need to address PFAS. It's globally dispersed. We can't control it. We don't know where it's going to end up. We don't know what its impacts are. And there's other parallels to other substances as well. Go to the next slide. Similarly, in the 70s, there were new discoveries about mechanisms of global transport and bioaccumulation of mercury, which led to some very rapid changes in mercury use and also some very slow changes. Paper, food contact, food crop pesticide, and some other uses were phased out almost immediately in the early 70s, and then other uses took close to 40 years to phase out, and it took about 35 to 40 years to even agree to have an international convention to address mercury. I think there are many strong parallels to the PFAS situation here with mercury. Next slide, please. We also have PFAS parallels to lead. I don't think it's well known how contaminated the earth is from lead used in gasoline for 60 to 70 years. And this is a great article I encourage everybody to read about Claire Patterson, who was trying to establish the age of the earth and found there was so much lead contamination that he had to go to Greenland ice cores and develop clean lab techniques in order to determine how old the earth is, and in the process revealed the true extent of lead contamination around the globe from human use. And again, drawing similarities between these and the chlorinated and fluorinated chemicals. There's a lot of similarities, and the chlorine chemistry issues are explored very well in Pandora's Poison by Joe Thornton, for those of you who've read that. Okay, our next couple slides are a timeline of the work we did, which is mostly our internal timeline. This is just here as a reference for when the presentation goes out. I don't think we really have to cover those too much right now. I've gone through most of that in the previous slides. So we could go to the sort of the wrap up here. So if you're interested in getting the detail on the model legislation, the request for comments, the comments we received, our response to comments, that's all available on the first link. And then we have a general fact sheet on the model legislation available at the second link. That doesn't really go into depth on the changes. It's a much more of an overview document. And another thing to note here is this is a model. This is a model that we put out for adoption. Nobody has adopted it yet. I believe that most of the member states agencies will be bringing it to their legislatures in 2022. And then we'll see how that goes. And then my last slide is just another pitch for pollution prevention as a bipartisan or nonpartisan solution. This is a great book written, 30 years ago, I guess. Gordon Durnall was a conservative business leader, politician. I can't remember exactly at the moment. He was appointed to the International Joint Commission in the 1980s under Reagan and Bush. The International Joint Commission implements the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 2012. And when he was appointed, he was very skeptical about the work of the Commission and governments and NGOs and industry to reduce toxics and how important it was. And he thought it was just getting in the way of industry. And by the time his terms were up, he had completely turned around on that, and he realized that eliminating the use of toxic chemicals was the only viable approach to cleaning up and maintaining high water quality in the Great Lakes that is relied on by millions of people and tens of thousands of businesses. I think it's a great book about technology, politics, and international policy. So I'm going to leave it there. We have some additional slides on screening projects and membership issues if anybody's interested in reviewing that, but we don't have to go over any of that today.
Great, thank you, John. I'm just giving people some time. There are a few questions and comments in here. I do see that Kevin Masterson has joined us. Kevin, are you able to unmute on your end?
Yes, Melissa.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, and I see a couple of questions here. I guess maybe we'll start with the first one for John. It's about the no detectable concentrations in clause in the model legislation that said nothing may be present at any concentration. And the question is, how does this address possible low levels of PFAS whose source is from global ubiquity?
Sure, that's a great question. The question is about the non-detect threshold for PFAS. I'm going to say that to some extent, that's a placeholder because we don't have any confidence that the analytical methods that currently are in play or in use are going to provide us the information that we need. There are some methods under development for total organic fluorine. There are methods used for total fluorine, and this is going to be a work in progress. We are planning to issue guidance on this issue as we continue to monitor what's going on, and we will probably have a threshold that's based on the detection limits of the best available methods as they continue to evolve. At the time we put this out, we did not have the confidence that we could say we can set a threshold because there are so many things in flux. And the point is virtual elimination of the material. So we are going to have something, yes. What that is, we'll have to work on as a follow-on to the model.
Great.
I guess
another question.
Another reason, can I just say one more thing? Another reason we want it in there is we want that to be a driver to divert high PFAS post-consumer material away from recycling and into a destruction management method.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kevin, I'm sorry.
No problem. is there an open forum planned where additional discussion will take place to take comments?
Well, we've had a public comment period on the draft model, and we have made some changes and issued what we believe should be the final. We are always willing to discuss that and entertain new ideas. We don't have any formal process planned at this time.
Great. And Melissa, do you see other questions?
Yep,
Yeah.
I see one here. Someone's asking, do the restrictions apply to all packaging levels? And they mentioned primary, secondary, and tertiary.
I believe the question is about what constitutes a package. And so, yes, it is all packaging. All levels of packaging, including transport packaging. We use the ASTM definition of packaging and packaging components. Now, when you're getting into the specific, there are some specific food packaging provisions. For example, Washington and Maine, and I forgot to mention New York, also passed a Pfas and fiber food packaging prohibition late last year, which does not require, it's a hard ban. It doesn't have any exemptions, doesn't require an alternatives analysis. Those definitions of food packaging vary, and not all of them include the transport packaging. Some of them cover only the components that are food contact, and some of them cover additional levels or components that aren't direct food contact, but are part of the food packaging, part of the package that has the food contact. Does that answer the question? I don't know if the person who asked
I think there are a few more questions coming in. There's one here. I think they just need some clarification, asking if the TPCH is currently engaged in active legislation at the state level to ban PFAS or other toxic chemicals in food packaging. And they say, I'm aware that Vermont has a proposed bill under consideration. And I can just share that the model legislation, if passed at the state level, would cover all packaging, including food packaging. So this is more expansive than a food packaging bill. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, John?
Sure. So the clearinghouse itself doesn't get involved in the passage of state bills. It serves as a information clearinghouse, but the individual states agency who are members do work on legislation in their own states and do talk to each other on a state-to-state basis. So there are a number of bills in play this session, I believe, that address PFAS in food packaging. There are a number of national environmental organizations and state-level environmental organizations who have been working on those bills. I know that some of the states have had discussions with those organizations about doing a broader approach with all packaging, as we've recommended in the model. Unfortunately, we didn't get the model out on the street until February of this year, which is a little bit late for some of the legislative sessions in 2021.
I guess this is related to another question that was already answered about unintentional impact of having no detectable threshold on post-consumer recycling, which might contain incidental levels of PFAS.
Sure, and that gets back to the previous answer, is that this is a work in progress as we try to determine what the analytical methods can support, what kind of detection limits we can come up with, what's the scope of the post-consumer problem. I can't remember the organization acronyms at the moment, but the the group that works on compostable foodware and serveware, they are developing standards for the residual amount that can be present using some of these methods for total organic fluorine that are currently being refined, and we've looked at what they're doing, but I don't think they're ready for prime time, and we don't think it's quite ready for prime time. But as that evolves, that we anticipate having that in the guidance that we're going to do.
And there's also a question about whether the slides will be available for download, and I believe they will. Right, Melissa?
They will.
Yes.
They'll be available as a PDF.
There is a question here, John, asking if the restrictions apply to all types of packaging for all products, and they note food, electronics, consumer goods, etc.
Yes, it's all packaging for all products. Again, we go with the ASTM definition of a package. There's no carve outs for anybody, or no sectors singled out either for or not having it.
And
that's been the case since the beginning. The original model legislation developed in the late 80s and enacted by the 19 states since then they have always covered all packaging and all packaging components for the 4 metals. So that is not new in any way.
And another one here is the best available analytical method you mentioned is total fluorine or total organic fluorine. Are you focused on added Pfas with these methods?
That's that's what we're working on with the guidance.
Okay.
Everything I've looked at, and my state government colleagues I've talked with, this is all evolving. It's not really something we can lock in on yet. We recognize that there's a lot of change going on. We need to see where it's going and be flexible about it.
John, there's a question here about when the guidance will be available.
Well, the model has not been enacted by anybody, so we will definitely have guidance ready before any state enacts the law, or before it goes into effect in any state. So probably in 2021, maybe 2022 is my current estimate.
Great. And there's a question here about what about imported packaging? Do we need to control all the imported packaging to comply with these laws?
Imported packaging is subject to the law. The laws cover anything that is sold or distributed in a state with the law. Its origin does not matter. Many of our screening projects have found flexible plastic film containing lead and cadmium made in China, or I should just say overseas, not single out China, but we have worked back through the retailers, the packaging suppliers, and the packaging manufacturers to address what we found. We've also found high levels of lead in certain glass food packaging, and we've worked with our domestic glass packaging institute to get them to address that with their international counterparts. That material that we've found has all come from overseas. But yes, it does apply to imported packaging.
Great, and there is a comment here that the link on the Toxics and Packaging website for the lab guidance is no longer available. So I will make note of that, and I know that
we should have an existing lab guidance document, but it doesn't cover the Pfas issue yet.
Correct.
It covers the metals. So when you look at our website, you're going to see things that apply to the current law, the 4 metals law that's in effect in the 19 states. And you're going to see some of the things that look forward to the new model. But again, the new model is not in effect anywhere. It is a proposal for the states that are interested in expanding what they have in place, or for the other 31 states to consider adopting.
I don't know if this was addressed already, but there's a question about how one slide mentioned that some uses could be allowed for PFAS based on risk assessments demonstrating safety. Why is this same policy not extended to orthophthalates, considering there are extensive risk assessments?
So any mention of allowing PFAS use following a risk assessment, those are things that we considered, but we did not include that in the model. And what the New York PFAS and fiber food packaging prohibition is a straight out prohibition effective in 2 years. The Washington and Maine laws covering PFAS in food packaging require an alternatives assessment for specific applications, and that alternatives assessment is about safer alternatives. So there's a risk assessment component inherent in the alternatives analyses that are or will be undertaken by those 2 states. But for the model, we have not included a risk assessment provision that would allow use of PFAS.
There is a question asking if there's a list of TPCH members on the website, and yes, you can find a map. One of the slides that John presented had the map, and it's color-coded with the 9 states that are members currently at TPCH, and it also there is a page with all the contact information, including our the Glass Packaging Institute and our historical member, Walter Chip Foley. So there is a listing that can be found.
Our distinguished alumni.
Distinguished alumni, that's right.
And one on the definition of PFAS as a substance containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. The comment is this lumps together persistent PFOA with short-lived gases designed to break down. Did you consider this definition appropriate? Do you consider this?
This is the definition that's in place in the laws that have been enacted.
John, there's a question. It says the version of the guidance I saw also says no detectable fluorine is allowed. Does that mean it includes impurities as well, not only intentional PFAS?
Is that a guidance we have?
Yeah, it's not noted.
Okay, because we have the language in the model, and we recognize that is going to require guidance, but we haven't done that guidance yet. So I don't know if somebody else has a standard of no detectable fluorine. BPI, potentially.
Yeah, the person is
clarifying.
The person that asked that question is clarifying that she meant it was in the model legislation.
Correct. What we have in the model is going to be covered in guidance because we recognize that this is an evolving situation. We may end up with a 1 ppm limit or 100 ppb or 10 ppb. Right now, we don't have the methods to be that we have confidence in. Will give us the information we need.
Great. I'm just looking through. Kevin, do you We can probably ask one more question before we need to wrap up.
Yeah, there's one comment about the fact that lab guidance is no longer available to download. I don't know if there's a link problem there or what.
Yes, yeah, some of this is just what John was just mentioning, is that we are reworking a lot of the pages on the website currently. So probably need at least another maybe month or two to have everything reflecting all of the changes that came from the new model legislation.
Right.
And we'll end with this one, John. It's more about our membership. Why has it been so difficult to obtain industry participation in TPCH efforts? I believe you said only one remains.
Well, I can't speak for industry, but industry associations go through change, and we had there's a couple of trade associations that are related to glass and ceramic decorating, and they had some kind of dispute between the two of them, or I'm on the outside, that's what it looked like to me, and one of them kind of shut down, and its members all went to the other one, and the other group decided we weren't important enough to stay involved in, and we asked them to be involved, and they declined. We had a paper representative for a couple of years, and then they decided to leave. I don't know why. Steel Recycling Institute has shifted its focus. They whatever the domestic steel industry is doing, they've decided that our topic is not one of their activities anymore. So in many cases, it's the industry itself. Glass packaging, I'm very happy they've stayed involved with us because they've had leadership changes and a lot of flux in the industry that affects their association, but they've chosen to continue being involved.
Great. And before I do the final wrap up, John, anything else you want to share? Thank you so much for all of the information that you've shared so far.
No, I just want to thank everybody for joining today. We had a great turnout. When I was invited to do this, I thought it was going to be 20 or 25 people associated with IC2. So a pleasant surprise, and good to get this information out to a much larger group of people. So thanks everybody for being on today.
Great. Yeah, and we did, looks like we had about 156 folks on your presentation today. So that's great to get this information out to a wider audience. So yes, thank you all. Oh, go ahead, John.
I also want to thank Melissa and Kevin and Terry and I'm spacing out. Lynn, sorry, Lynn, for everything you did to put this together. I didn't have to worry about anything but the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and it was really great to do a joint presentation from the two organizations. So thank you all for attending and for all of your great questions. We couldn't get to them all, but it was great seeing them come through and asking more clarifications from John. And many thanks again to John for all of his information. We do have the slides. There are some additional slides tacked on to the end of this as well, just so you would have those resources. So we will get those out to you shortly. And you can, as I said in the beginning, you can find our contact information throughout the slides. And if you would like to follow up with IC2 or TPCH for any more information, just let me or John know. Hope you all have a great remainder of your day, and I will be ending the broadcast now.